Hey guys, Master Shi here, and today I'll be sharing with you my three Cryo Cannon Generalist builds. So these builds excel in a lot of scenarios, but I'll explain later on which missions you should avoid using them. So right now, let's get on to it. So two of the three builds are really similar in nature in that you'll be using them to quickly freeze mobs or crowds. And in my opinion, that's what the Cryo Cannon really excels at. It's crowd control. These two builds are very similar to each other, but they are still different builds at the end of the day with different overclocks. While the third build, although it's still a generous build, it's more also of a niche build for the Cryo Cannon. So you'll find out later what I'm talking about. Now for the first two builds, they both excel at freezing. Let's move on first to the first build, which uses a tune cooler balanced overclock. This is the best overclock in terms of freezing your enemies. For the mods, I used all the mods that are really good for freezing enemies in tier 1 and tier 4. And for tier 2, I picked overclock ejection turbine because the Cryo Cannon does have really short range, but it's really up to you which mod you want to pick here in tier 2, but I just really prefer range. Now for tier 3, I pick charge speed so that it does refill the pressure chamber faster, and this is to cover for the flaw of the balance overclock, which is the pressure chamber refills at a slower rate. So I used mod 1 here in tier 3 for that. And then also of course we have cold radiance, and that's for the freezing power. So that's the first build, and let's move on to the second one. Believe it or not, but this is the build that I really use in terms of a generalist build when it comes to freezing enemies. Yeah, I use this a lot more than the tuned cooler overclock, and that's the improved thermal efficiency clean overclock. So it does have a freezing power of 10 versus the tuned cooler's 11, but I find that this is still really good at freezing enemies. And you rarely also overheat with this clean overclock because you do shoot longer. You can hold down your left click much longer before it does reach overheat. So it's almost the same as the Tune Cooler overclock. I do have all the freeze mods. So tier 1 it's 3, tier 4 it's 2, also cold radiance. I still stick with reach for tier 2 overclock ejection turbine, but in tier 3 I pick rate of fire over charge speed, and that's because this clean overclock you do shoot longer before needing to pressurize, so you really have no need for refilling the pressure chamber faster. You rarely will need to repressurize or reach overheat when you hold down left click when you're using this overclock, and that's the reason why I just stuck with rate of fire. It's just the logical decision to do. For my third build, so I did mention that it's kind of a niche, although it's still generalist, it's kind of niche, and that's because we have the crystal nucleation balance overclock. So everyone knows by now that it is like a sticky flame for the Cryo Cannon. But the way I use it is also much the way I use the sludge pump, which is to cover a lot of space with goo. But instead of goo, you're covering space with crystals, or the crystals coming from your Cryo Cannon. The thing is that when it comes to controlling space, I do stick with my sludge pump build. I have a sludge pump build for covering a lot of space with the sludge. But I find that this new overclock for the Cryo Cannon also fills that very same role, that very same purpose from the sludge pump, and it does a better job at it too because it does freeze. At first I didn't think that it would freeze enemies that cross the crystals, but it does freeze them. It is very good at it, by the way. But this is the build I use, so I still have all the freeze mods for tier 1, tier 4, tier 5. But in tier 2, I have larger reserve tank because you do have less ammo for this balance overclock. And then for tier 3, I have improved pump so that we can refill the pressure chamber much faster so that you don't reach overheat as much frequently. Because you won't really be firing at enemies directly with this balance overclock anyway. You'll be covering terrain with your crystals, with your ice, instead of shooting directly, unless it's a flying enemy. But in case you'll be using the Cryo Cannon against flying enemies, then I suggest using with either of these builds, the first two that I mentioned, because they're far better when it comes to flying enemies. But this one, the third one, is much better for the ground-based enemies because you can just fire ice crystals on the ground and just leave it be. That covers my primaries. And let's move on to my secondary, which is the Wave Cooker. So this is how I configure my wave cooker. So for tier 1, it's damage, and the reason I choose damage is because there will be times when you'll be using the wave cooker to snipe enemies from afar, and the wave cooker is really good at firing at enemies from a very long range. I think it's one of the guns that have the longest range in the game. So maybe there's a spitter on the ceiling that's really far away, or there's a cave leech that's really far away. You can't reach them with a cryo cannon. The only ways to reach them is with your wave cooker. So that's why I picked damage. And for tier 2, you can really you can be more liberal with any of these, but I pick rate of fire so that I can kill things sooner, faster, from a farther distance. And for tier 3, of course, it has to be temperature amplifier so that you can freeze enemies quickly, so that you can spread your freeze status effect among all the enemies that you've just frozen. You can just freeze 1 or 2 and firing them with the Colette Wave Cooker, and that frozen status effect will just spread like wildfire. Wildfire, guys. I'm sure you know where that reference from, I hope. And for tier 4, I pick Power Supply Overdrive. It's another rate of fire mod, and it's because this one, the wide lens add-on, it's just, well, you have to press reload to activate it, and man, it does use more heat per shot, so I'm not finding really any reason why you have to go with this mod. So it's really naturally going to be this mod, so that's the reason why I picked this one, aside from helping from DPS also. And for tier 5, of course, it has to be the exothermic reactor so that we can proc temp shock in enemies, and that causes more damage. And it does also trigger that spreads a mist of extreme heat or cold in this case. So for the overclock, we have mega power supply, and it's even more faster rate of fire, but it does suffer from a decreased cooling rate and slower overheat recovery. So when you're using this overclock, always keep an eye on the overheat gauge. That wraps up the secondary. For the pickaxe, you can just really choose which any of these, but I find this to be more effective damage. For Satchel Charge, my Satchel Charge configured in such a way that it's for blowing up terrain. So maybe it's for making tunnels, for making bunkers and whatnot. Oh, for the drills, this is important because I have my driller's drills configured differently from my other builds. So for this one, it's barb drills so that we can inflict more damage on frozen enemies. When they're frozen, you do inflict more damage on them when they're frozen. And if you choose this barb drills, it does even more damage, and that's also because we'll be using vampire perk for cryo cannon builds. Yeah, there's really no other reason to pick any of these other mods. It's all gonna be all damage because we're relying a lot also on melee damage for this build. And for tier 2, it's cooling so that we can cool our drills faster when we're not using it. And then tier 4, it's bloody cold drills because we're gonna be a melee cold vampire driller. So of course the impact axe for our grenades, because we'll be throwing the impact axe every now and then when we freeze the enemies and we want to take some life from them. And here I pick this one so that we can regenerate our shields sooner. This is a matter of preference. You can pick any of these here. And for tier 2, I really you have to pick healthy because we're a vampire driller. So more health, the better. And tier 4, it's of course breathing room so that we have that sweet temporary invulnerability after being revived. So for the perks, you can really pick any perk, but what's really required here is vampire and iron will, because Iron Will is just really that good. Now when I play solo, I use Berserker, but when I play multiplayer, I go with Field Medic, just that I can revive my teammates more often and better and quicker. Yeah, that would be it for my builds for the Cryo Cannon. So I did mention that this is a generalist build. It's very versatile, it's very viable in a lot of scenarios, but when you're in solo, I would not recommend it in industrial sabotage, in elimination, and escort duty, but you can use it in any of these other missions. Mining expedition up to deep scan. These builds are really good. So for escort duty, it's not really that good because of the floating rocks. You don't have a lot of means to break the rocks. For elimination, these are the builds I mentioned don't have really high single target damage, so it's not good for elimination either. And same thing for industrial sabotage. So guys, you have to try out these cryo cannon builds. They are pretty strong once you learn how to use them. And let me know in the comments how you find them. See you in the next one.